Um, on behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, most recent calls to action, and ways you can join ongoing solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks as always for sticking with us. Please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. You can also share the recordings, which are available on YouTube on our YouTube channel for CPE. This week, we will be going straight into our conversation with Samer about updates. There's a lot that's happened this week, both domestically and a lot of very important updates about what's happened on the ground in Gaza this week, in addition to the tragic news of even more brutal killings that have involved the maiming and killing of children and other atrocities in Gaza. To help us make sense of it, let's bring up Samer Arabi from Iraq. Samer, thanks for joining us. Like we're both on the road, so managing a lot of background stuff. But glad we're able to do this. I think it's important for us to provide these updates as much as we can, and there's a lot to discuss this week. So I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here. And yeah, apologies. I think all of us are traveling this week in some capacity or another. So we're trying our best, but please forgive me any shortcomings or things that I missed. It's been another really impactful week. A lot to discuss. So jumping right into it, the very grim milestone that we hit this week that we've seen coming for a little while now is the official death toll ticking over to 40,000. Uh, you know, there's so much to unpack here, including, the thing that everybody on this call, I'm sure, already knows, which is that these numbers, while they continue to be important in that they remain the official record, have become such, a drastic undercount of what the actual death toll is in Gaza as a result of, the complete destruction of the health infrastructure across the Gaza Strip, making it basically impossible to identify the dead. So even this number, unimaginably high, is itself a fraction of the violence that's been inflicted on Palestinians over the course of this genocide. So a thing to sit with. And again, we've talked about many times that death toll needs to be understood as only the casualties of direct military engagement with the IDF and not the many tens of thousands who have died and the hundreds of thousands who will from the lack of infrastructure, the destruction of sanitation systems, malnutrition, and disease. One small example of this was a report that the government in Gaza put out this week, claiming that due to the closing of the Rafah border by the IDF, they can attribute about 1,000 additional deaths to that border closing as a result of the loss of humanitarian aid and medical assistance. It's a hard number to quantify for a lot of reasons, but the assault in Rafah, which again, as folks know, was intended to be a limited military operation, according to the Israelis, in order to get U.S. buy-in, has now been ongoing for well over 2 months and has become one of the areas of greatest violence inflicted by the Israelis in the Gaza Strip. And you can see on the right here, this map of all the bombing locations of the IDF in Gaza. And you can see Rafah down there in the southwest corner. And just, the scale of the devastation really sort of beggars belief. One thing that's been happening in Rafah, and not only in Rafah, obviously, across the Gaza Strip, but that the Israeli newspaper Haaretz did a new investigative piece on the practice of using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Mind you, the word civilians was used here carefully, even by like an institution like Haaretz, to specify that these aren't even people that are accused of being like Hamas fighters or affiliated with the resistance in any meaningful way. They're just people they pick up, put a IDF uniform on, and send into the tunnels so that if anything happens, it happens to them and not to IDF soldiers in terms of like booby traps and whatnot. This isn't the first investigation into this practice. It's a well-known, wide-ranging thing that the IDF has been doing for years now, decades actually. You know, there have been Supreme Court cases about the IDF's use of human shields. And so, like, you know, another chapter in the very long book of every accusation is a confession, in terms of the way the Israeli military comports itself. The thing about this investigation that I think is new and noteworthy, is the extent to which the information is coming not only from Israeli soldiers on the ground, but senior Israeli military officials who are on some level acknowledging that this is a practice that's known and condoned, if not like officially sanctioned. So just the sort of ubiquity of that, I think, is an important way of understanding what's happening. Moving up north just a little bit to Khan Yunis, an area that we've been talking about a lot for the past few weeks, just due to the scale of Israel's assaults there and the sort of circular nature of those assaults, where they go in, they destroy a lot of things, they kill a lot of people, they claim that some, you know, militant infrastructure has been dismantled, and then they leave only to repeat the same process again a week later or a couple of weeks later. So the worst fighting right now continues to be in Khan Yunis, where I truly have lost track. I tried to figure out what number of assault this is on Khan Yunis, and it's got to be at least 6 at this point. There's like analysis coming out about what Israel is really trying to do with this sort of repeated incursions, you know, because as a military strategy tactic, it obviously isn't working, nor has it ever worked. If you look at, you know, for example, the US in Iraq or Afghanistan, to the point now with the level of repetition now where it seems increasingly clear that the Israeli military understands that this isn't an effective way to beat Hamas, but rather in only, you know, like the only gains you can get from a strategy like this is the destruction of infrastructure and like the loss of life. So I like at this point, if it wasn't already abundantly clear, this sort of cyclical nature of violence really seems to be pointing to just an ongoing campaign to you know, commit genocide, right? To destroy the means of sustenance across the Gaza Strip, in an act that I think really falls within that framework. You know, we saw really a bone-chilling development this week where the Israeli military sent a truck back to Khan Yunis, just filled with dead bodies, and just dropped them off outside the city without any explanations, without any indication of who they are, where they were killed, under what means, whatever. And, you know, this is, it's hard to interpret this as anything other than an act of terrorism. Further north a little bit in Deir al-Balah, in the middle of Gaza, a thing that I think really caught attention this week was a targeted precision strike on an apartment building. You can see here, I was trying to find a better picture of it, and I didn't in time. I apologize, but you can see on the right the way that this missile only hit one apartment building, like through the window of an apartment building. They killed a mother and her newborn 3-day-old twins, right when her husband had gone to the hospital to register those twins' births. And again, a series of questions around why a doctor and her children would be targeted in this way. No answers given, of course, but another sort of, you know, I truly struggle with what to say about things like this other than they deserve our attention and for us to bear witness, and to just sit with, you know, the ongoing horror of what Gaza continues to become. And the worst example of that this week that I'm sure a lot of folks saw was the attack on the school complex, which had become a refugee shelter in Gaza City, up in the north of Gaza, where an airstrike resulted in at least 80 people being killed. The number is likely well over 100, in such a horrific fashion that Palestinians on the ground haven't been, at least last I checked, which was a few days ago, haven't been able to recover a single body, like not one intact body, which, Israel is claiming a couple of things here that I think are worth unpacking for a minute. One, they're saying that the death toll has to be inflated because they are using precision munitions, and the other that they were attacking a Hamas command center, and then provided a list, I think, of like 19 names of people they accused of being Hamas militants, who were killed in the strike. And just to take a moment to interrogate both of those claims. The first, it does seem that precision munitions were used. So like the smaller payload precision bombs dropped by the Israeli Air Force. But critically, those bombs, which are hyper directed, the same sort of thing that we saw earlier with the bomb that went through that window, to hit the foundations of the school in a moment where a very large group of people was conducting prayer service, Friday prayers, in that moment specifically to cause the entire thing to collapse, right? So the precision munitions were used in a very precise way to cause the building to collapse. So the whole precision munitions thing is like true, but obviously the narrative they're spinning around it demonstrably false. And then the list of 19 names, as I'm sure folks are used to at this point, was nonsense. It was complete nonsense, as it has been since, the Al Shifa hospital fiasco from what is now almost a year ago, where it included names of people who had previously died months before. It included names of people who had died at the other end of the Gaza Strip. And for some of the people that it had named that were in fact killed in this strike, they were people who have been known and like publicly positioned themselves as fierce critics of Hamas, for example. So like the idea that those people are anything other than a sort of randomly generated Israeli list of names, I think, once again shows that the very low effort they're putting into justifying the indiscriminate slaughter of people. In the West Bank, in addition to the sort of ongoing campaign of land grabbing and displacement that we've been talking about over the past few weeks, the small new update here was on the Netzeh Yehuda battalion, which is actually no longer in the West Bank, but was the one IDF military outfit that was sanctioned by the US government a few months back. If folks remember, we talked about this. US government attempt to decide that it would no longer be financing this one battalion, which was accused of, and accused is a really generous way of saying it. There have been many documented instances of this battalion killing civilians, terrorizing the population, destroying people's homes and property, etc. To the extent that even by the standards of the way that the Israeli military conducts itself, this battalion was considered to be beyond the pale. And the United States, back when Biden was trying to demonstrate some extremely limited pressure on the Israeli government, had decided to sanction this one singular battalion. And as we discussed at the time, that sanction lasted about a month before they then issued additional guidance to the Israeli government saying, well, you can fund them. We don't have a problem with anybody else giving them money, but we're not going to let any US money go to that battalion. So they backtracked very, very quickly on that commitment. And then just this past week, around the same time that, all these new arms shipments that were released to Israel got announced, which we'll get to, they've decided to reverse that ban. And so that battalion is now once again receiving US support. They've moved to the Golan Heights, and they have apparently undergone a review, and that some members of the battalion have been reprimanded, which is the justification that they've given to refund this unit. But, I think really speaks to the changing perspective of the Biden administration about who it needs to appease in this moment. Getting to some of those arms shipments announced around the same time as the lifting on the sanctions on that battalion, we saw at the end of last week that the US government or specifically the executive branch, has released that $3.5 billion of aid, of military aid to Israel. This is that same money that was allocated by Congress a couple of months ago. This was that long-running aid to Ukraine and Israel bill that had gotten caught up by Republicans blocking it because of the aid to Ukraine part. And when that bill finally got passed, it does generally take a couple of months for that money to go through, and this is that money. So, there's a couple sides to this. On the one hand, it's not a new batch of money being given to the Israeli government. It's money that sort of got dragged out a little bit. But the administration choosing to release it now, I think it does tell us something. And I think it might be related to the ceasefire in a way that we'll come back to. Similarly, the Biden administration has decided to send $262 million of JDAMs, these the munitions that are sometimes used to make like dumb bombs into smart bombs, and a series of other things, along with a new approved $20 billion in weapons sales to Israel, announced also just a few days ago. All of this just in the past week. So, what we saw, like a minimal gesture from the Biden administration about withholding arms to Israel, particularly after the Rafah offensive. And now we're seeing the floodgates really open. In this, at the same time, Israel has started manufacturing its own large-scale bombs, with the expectation that at some point the US is going to stop providing them. So, I think the Israelis are reading the winds a little bit better probably than even the US administration is, about the direction this inevitably has to go, because obviously this is not sustainable by any, forget moral, but even just like political calculus. It's important, I think, to distinguish a little bit between what this is and what that $3.5 billion is, because the $3.5 billion is aid, right? And so often when we say stop military aid to Israel, we're talking about a number of things, but core among them is, like US taxpayer money just being given to the Israelis for weapons. This is $20 billion in sales, meaning that they're expecting the Israelis to pay for it, and some chunk of it will probably come from the military aid that we've been giving them. And these sales, are months or years long processes. So this doesn't really impact the ability of Israel to carry out its genocide in the short term, but obviously it has very big implications for the medium and long term. It's worth noting that the $3.5 billion weapons dispersal happened the same day as the attack on that Gaza school in Gaza City, which, just a really like awful sort of confluence of events. And the other thing that I just wanted to touch on very quickly on the weapons distribution stuff is this article I found by Dylan Saba with Tim Barker writing the introductions, that goes into a lot of detail about the mechanics of US weapons sales. If you're interested in really getting into all the details on this, I don't think it's stuff that most people really need to know. But if you want to understand how these processes work, I found it to be a really, really fascinating article. So I would highly recommend it. So all of these weapon shipments, I think, we need to sort of assess why this moment, for this dispersal of all of these weapons, given, the increasingly ostensibly souring relationship between the US and Israel, the increasing threat of a regional war, and the receding possibility of a ceasefire. But it's not inconceivable, I think, to understand this as a gesture by the Biden administration to give Israel what it wants, with the expectation that it will in turn act a little bit more favorably towards the ceasefire negotiations that started yesterday. And just to say, that's been the Biden administration strategy from the very beginning. It's, the newest version of the bear hug, the idea that if they do whatever Israel says, then hopefully Israel will listen to them. And, we've seen how well that's worked in the past, but here we are again for some reason. It's worth, I think, reflecting for a bit on how this round of ceasefire negotiations is being described by a lot of folks as a now or never moment. The idea being that if this round of ceasefire negotiations isn't successful, people don't really feel like there's going to be another productive session post this. Like there's just, there's no ground on which to meet, and it's very likely that the Israelis, if they don't accept this round, will just move on. The US and the EU is clearly positioning themselves as, or rather, I guess, they're all conceiving of this ceasefire as the opportunity to prevent this regional war. So there's clearly been pressure put on Iran, and Iran has responded, not officially, but through like leaks and secondary channels, that a ceasefire in Gaza could either delay or prevent retaliation after the Israel's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh on Iranian soil. So they're putting a lot of stock in these negotiations as being the thing that could conceivably stop the regional war from escalating. Whether that's likely or not is a little bit of a different question. You can see the United States exerting its pressure on trying to get the ceasefire signed through a series of different things. And among them, I think, the sort of official mouthpiece of the United States government, the New York Times, I had a fascinating article to this effect on how US military officials have analyzed the battlefield and determined that Israel's military has, quote, reached the end of the line, basically saying that, that US officials are skeptical that the approach will yield decisive results. So, Hamas is like well entrenched in its tunnel system and in the population of Gaza. And so like the war doesn't further degrade Hamas's capabilities. And that Israel hasn't demonstrated this. I find this part quite critical, that the Pentagon is saying that Israel hasn't demonstrated that it can secure all the areas of Gaza that it has seized, particularly after its forces pull back. This is what we were talking about in Khan Yunis, the idea that Israel can't maintain control over the areas that it's occupying, and as soon as it leaves, Hamas regains control more or less immediately. And so, like, all it's doing at this point is killing civilians, which again might very well be the point. But the fact that this is being sort of put out in the New York Times is clearly meant to be a signaling towards Israel. And the other interesting thing about this article is I think it gives us a little bit of a window into what the Israelis are thinking too, because they responded to these claims basically saying like nonsense. And continuing to say, there's an interview with an Israeli general who says if Israel evacuates its forces now, within a year, Hamas will be strong again, which that's the assessment of basically everybody who's looked at this. But the additional part of that assessment is that even if they stay for another year, that doesn't change those dynamics. Like they basically reached the limit of what they're capable of doing. But the way this general describes it is that another 2 to 3 months of high intensity fighting, and after that, a transition to conducting intelligence-based raids and strikes for around a year. So, this obviously isn't actually intended to, eliminate Hamas, is the argument they're always using, but one that doesn't really hold much water. But it does give us some insight into what the Israeli military is, at least in this moment, claiming to be the thing that they want to do. Folks remember 3 months ago, the claim was, we just need another couple of weeks in Rafah and then we'll be completely done. And then once they were in Rafah, it was, we need another couple months to like mop up some operations and then we'll be done. And here we are with them claiming they need another 2 to 3 months. So, it's hard to say how long this sort of game is going to keep going on, but it seems very obvious, I think, to folks that until there's pressure on them to do otherwise, this is just going to keep extending indefinitely in this manner. As I mentioned, the EU is pushing really hard to make the ceasefire happen. A really incredible, a remarkable letter put out by the tripartite countries, so France, Germany, and the UK, here on the left, basically endorsing the ceasefire and calling for all parties to accept it. it's clearly meant to pressure Israel into accepting the ceasefire negotiation, but in this typical way that I think really more than anything demonstrates the failures of Western liberalism to confront really anything. Uh, it's a statement about getting Israel to sign the ceasefire that literally doesn't even contain the word Israel. Like they refuse to even call the country by its name. They just have to use these like vague assertions about like parties need to accede to blah blah blah. Well, obviously they have no problem saying things like Hamas needs to agree, but because the issue right now is Israel not agreeing, they can't muster the courage to say that. Hamas actually put out a response to this letter, and that's what's on the right here with the highlights. Basically, a thing that we've talked about quite a bit, saying we were fine with the ceasefire agreement as articulated by Biden, the one that like the Security Council endorsed. We have been fine with that agreement and we were ready to sign it. We continue to be ready to sign it. But because the Israelis are introducing a series of new stipulations that are, that were designed specifically for Hamas to not accept them. These are ones that we've talked about in past weeks around Israel's continued control of the Rafah border crossing and the Philadelphia corridor, but also a continued military presence throughout the Gaza Strip, basically the ongoing checkpoints and other things that Hamas has said from the very beginning would be non-starters for ceasefire negotiations. So Hamas is actually not attending the ceasefire negotiations that are happening as of yesterday. At least as of yesterday, they weren't attending. I don't know if things have changed in the past 24 hours. Because they're no longer based on the original ceasefire proposals, they're starting this whole new process, and Hamas is basically saying, like, this is a waste of time, and it's clearly designed as a stalling tactic. And you can see here at the bottom, it calls on mediators to submit a plan to implement what they presented and approved on February 7th. Sorry, I had to switch the US and Europe in my head there. Based on Biden's vision and the Security Council resolution, and to oblige the Israeli occupation to do so, instead of going to more rounds of negotiations or new proposals that provide cover for the occupation's aggression and give it more time to perpetuate the war of genocide against our people. So, like, things aren't looking good on the ceasefire front. It's not feeling very likely that that's going to be moving forward anytime soon. I mean, you never know. Maybe there's going to be some giant breakthrough on the ceasefire negotiations this week. We'll see, I think, within the next week, whether there's any real movement on that. But given where the two parties are at, which is Hamas sort of sticking to the idea that only the old ceasefire proposal is acceptable, and Netanyahu saying nothing unless we get to stay in Gaza indefinitely, yeah, it's not looking good. And again, Israel feels no pressure to do otherwise. And I think these releases of military aid were designed, I think, partly to incentivize it to act differently, but wouldn't count on it. Definitely wouldn't count on it. The last little bit on the ceasefire that I wanted to touch on was this leaked indication that Trump and Netanyahu had a phone call to talk about the ceasefire deal, where ostensibly Trump told Netanyahu he needed to agree to a ceasefire immediately. The Israelis have denied this call took place. The Trump campaign has refused to comment. But if it did take place, and I think it probably did, there are some interesting implications to that. I think Mu'in Rabbani does a much better job of explaining it than I ever could. So I included a link to his analysis here, basically saying there might be a dangerous aspect of this phone call because in many ways, the Israeli government seems to have been acting as if it wanted to get past this election season, like just hold on and then we'll figure things out later when its position is a little bit more secured. So, like, they were expecting Trump to win, who obviously I think would give them a total blank check. And if he didn't, then Biden would have won. And they've seen how things are with Biden. If Biden doesn't have to worry about re-election, they were expecting things to be much smoother and they could do whatever they wanted. If Trump is starting to see the lack of a ceasefire as a liability, even for him, right? Because even Republicans, remember, are broadly in favor of a ceasefire and ending U.S. support to Israel. I mentioned this a few weeks ago when I was at the the rallies against Netanyahu speaking in front of Congress, that there were MAGA folks at the rally because they were like, yeah, we also don't want to be giving money to Israel. So that's starting to sort of manifest in a way that potentially could be making the Israelis a little bit nervous, because if Trump is less willing to sort of go along with what's happening than he has been, and Kamala Harris, obviously, I think has taken a stronger tack and is still at least flirting with the idea of an arms embargo, that might mean that the calculus for the Israelis is to do something much sooner than they would have otherwise. So this could be signs of potential escalation, but hard to say. A quick touch on the ICC. Just wanted to note two things from that process. One, we talked last week about the right to rape riots, the fact that Israelis had been, they took over a court and a series of other army and government buildings to protest the idea that soldiers were being arrested for raping Palestinians. And we talked about how the only reason that those people were arrested in the first place was because of potential for ICC and ICJ implications. And that's borne out very directly. Like you can see here that the lead attorney for the for defense services in Israel said the investigation of the torture of Palestinian detainees was, quote, an effort to shield us from the armed forces, shield us and the armed forces from international tribunals, right? So just to say, again, even while those systems are failing, and even though they haven't really prevented the violence, we shouldn't ignore the impact that they do have, even if it's limited. And then similarly, on the domestic front with the ICC, it seems that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hasn't done well, not that they do much to begin with, but hasn't done anything for months, like no appointments. And that's largely because Republicans refuse to vote on anything else until the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passes a sanction on the ICC. And Democrats are not opposed to that in theory. They just disagree on the language. So they're sort of hashing that out now, and it'll be interesting and a little horrifying to see where they land. A quick update on some boycott, divestment, sanctions developments over the past week. On the academic boycott front, in my opinion, a really big development. The American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, which is a very large and very powerful body within academia, has had a longstanding opposition to the idea of academic boycotts. In theory, but obviously, meant to be a statement on the BDS campaign's academic boycotts. They've removed that opposition. So they're now saying that they're no longer in opposition to the idea of academic boycotts, and that there are certain circumstances where they're not only permissible, but morally required. And they don't use the word Palestine in that statement, but it's very clear what this is about. There's also, over the course of the updates, I always point out a couple articles that I think are worth reading, and this is definitely one of them, the Truth Out one from Craig Mukhaibed, the State Department official that resigned, 6 or so months ago, about the impact of the ICJ rulings on the BDS movement and the ways in which it will, over the long run, create all of these dynamics that will lead to significant growth in the BDS movement. It's a very well written, very well researched article that I took a little bit of solace from. Turning to the elections quickly, after a few really disheartening election cycles, particularly around Bowman and Cori Bush, and the ways that AIPAC was able to buy their way into winning those seats away from the squad. We saw Ilhan Omar win her seat by double digits, which was good to see, despite the fact that there was once again a giant dark money campaign against her, although it's not clear how involved AIPAC was in this case directly. But there was a now leaked a set of communications between Zionist forces that were trying to sink her campaign and put money behind her opponent. who has previously been an AIPAC darling. And those leaks are really something. They're really something. And I think, lay bare in a way that a lot of us have been feeling a certain way about how forces align against us, and I think are showing it in a little bit more stark detail. So, like you can see here, the fundraising for Ilhan Omar's opponent on a thread for Richie Torres, the AIPAC's #1 donor, who is a congressman in New York that I got to heckle at the airport a couple weeks ago. That was a delight. Like literally saying out loud, we need to be supportive of alt-right Christian neo-Nazis to fight off the socialist, Marxist, anarchist, radical Islamists. So like, if it has felt like liberals have been flirting with Nazis because of their opposition to the liberation of Palestine, like there it is, like written out, plain as day. So I was shocked when I saw that, but perhaps I shouldn't have been. Wanted to take a minute just to reflect on some legislation that's happening in California that, is part of this like ongoing attempt to silence Palestine advocacy on campuses, both university and primary schooling. I borrowed all of this language from a JVP email, and forgive me for putting a wall of text onto the slide, but you can see the various ways in which these 4 different bills, 2 assembly bills and 2 Senate bills, are designed specifically for chilling free speech, for making sure that any conversations about genocide are managed only by like Zionist organizations. And of course, direct attacks on ethnic studies, which has been a long-running thing, right? Because of the ways that ethnic studies incorporates issues of Palestinian displacement, dispossession, and oppression. So I would really encourage you to reach out to your legislators about these. Not all 4 of them, only 3 of them, because we did manage to, well, people working on this managed to sink one of those bills already in committee, luckily. But there's still obviously a lot to do. The other big thing, of course, is the DNC is coming up. The Democratic National Conventions starts on Monday, which means folks are gearing up for engaging with the Democrats and making sure that people's voices are heard outside of that convention hall. Obviously, I think the Democratic Party establishment is feeling terrified about what's going to be happening this weekend, as well they probably should be. And just to note, just a few days ago, we saw Palestine protesters like break into a Democratic after party, I think in New York, where they set off a series of smoke bombs, like disruptive enough that it led to a series of mass arrests. And if that's happening, at some like small after party event, like I don't know what the DNC is going to look like, but I suspect a lot of people are going to be there, and it's going to make a mark. So if you're in Chicago or can get to Chicago or know people who are in Chicago, definitely recommend that you connect them to the actions that are happening there. Almost lastly, zooming back to California or in the Bay Area specifically, folks probably heard that the Golden Gate 26, the 26 folks who were arrested for blocking the Golden Gate Bridge, calling for an end to U.S. arming Israel, have been charged with felonies by San Francisco's lovely district attorney, Brooke Jenkins, who has been just like absolutely atrocious on Palestine stuff forever. And so like, it's really hard to see this as anything but an intimidation tactic to try to stop, the Palestine movement from, mobilizing, taking up space, being loud, and forcing society to pay attention, right? And like disrupting business as usual enough to force change, which incidentally, the same way that every social movement has in US history. So I think it's really critical to make sure that this intimidation tactic fails, and that Brooke Jenkins, who is running for re-election, this post is by her opponent in the November election, make sure that she realizes that it's a huge liability to be going after people like this. So please sign that petition if you have not yet. I think the link is probably in the chat, and it's here, bit.ly/GG26 petition. And then the last thing I wanted to muse on just very briefly at the end here, because today was just the Sammer show, so apparently I have all the time in the world. I wanted to reflect on some of the conversations that have been happening, I think mostly on TikTok, which, I'm not on, but last week I said brat, so I'm just trying to be more culturally relevant over time. Um, that the way the discourse of like Palestinian activism around Kamala Harris has been perceived by some as anti-Blackness. I don't really have an answer to this, but I did want to raise it because I think it's an important thing for us to grapple with as a community. And in the ways that I think folks in the Black community have been feeling like attacking people for saying they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, like negates the feelings of, or, negates the assessment of communities' own safety and security and their positionality vis-a-vis the two parties. While I think folks have also rightly been holding the feeling that like voting for Kamala Harris, who is part of an administration that has been perpetuating this genocide, also feels bad. And so like holding those two things together, I think can sometimes be hard to do well. And I think it's really important for us to always reflect on the idea that like our Palestine organizing has never been just about Palestine, right? It's about obviously immediately ending this genocide, but also ending the systems that allow that genocide to continue, and like building a framework and a space for the liberation of all people. And I think that requires us to really carry and weigh the conversations we're having with comrades working in parallel fights, to make sure that our own discourse isn't coming at somebody else's expense. There's so much to say about this, and I probably didn't do it justice throwing it in at the end of a presentation, but if folks want to discuss it, I mean, it might be good to have an event on that. And just to sum up very quickly, it has been a particularly gruesome week in ways that have been sort of eclipsed by the media narrative on Iran and regional wars, like has allowed folks to not pay attention to a lot of the violence that's been happening in Palestine. While all of those things combined are creating a dynamic where the ceasefire negotiations feel both more urgent than ever and less likely than ever. So that's a hard moment to sit with. While the Biden administration, went through a series of military sales and the desanctioning of that Israeli battalion, showing a total unwillingness to meaningfully pivot from this in this political moment, despite having every incentive to do so. So is a scary development that I think really implies a lot about what needs to be done to put pressure on the US political class in a way that can make an arms embargo closer to a reality, which again, I do think is a thing that's conceivable within the next, I don't know how long, but in the nearish future, I do think an arms embargo is a conceivable outcome, though obviously not under Biden, and certainly not under Trump. Lastly, just that Palestine organizing in the US seems to be under organized attack. We're seeing it from all of this legislation. We're seeing it in the ways that various forces are mobilizing. But as long as we remain a coordinated movement and that movement is grounded in the broader movement for liberation, we do have the ability to fight back and kill some of these bills and protect some of our people that are being incarcerated. So there's a lot to do, but together we can do it, I hope. And last upcoming actions, the big DNC actions are happening this weekend and next week. There's a parallel action happening in the Bay Area at Lake Merritt on Sunday at 11 a.m. I hope to see you there. And this isn't really an action, but I do want to encourage folks to do this No Recess for Gaza campaign from the Arms Sales Accountability Project. Basically just calling your member of Congress and telling them, instead of taking a recess and just hanging out, you should be taking some action to stop sending weapons to Israel. And then per usual, if you want to know what else is happening this month, please check out the events calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text updates on the things that we're up to, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the Palestine Media Tracker if you want more information on the articles that inform this analysis. And I think that'll do it. Thank you all so much. And I know Thomas had to run, but I think Annie is still around.